Have you ever wondered why an entire community would abandon their tropical home and, generations later, still be unable to return to it? Somewhere in the vast blue emptiness of the North Pacific Ocean, roughly equidistant between Australia, Japan, and the American state of Hawaii, lies a scattered nation of around 42,000 people known as the Marshall Islands. Its people, the Marshallese, are a subgroup of Micronesians closely related to other Pacific Island ethnic groups, and they speak a language entirely their own. The country is made up of 5 main islands, more than 1,200 smaller ones, and around 24 coral atolls sprinkled across an enormous stretch of ocean. Yet of all these tiny specks of land, one uninhabited atoll has become the most famous of them all, a place whose very name is now shorthand for the terrifying power of the thermonuclear age. It is called Bikini Atoll, and today we're going to explore exactly why, all these years later, nobody can call it home. To understand Bikini, you first have to understand the strange and lopsided relationship between the Marshall Islands and the United States. People have lived on these islands for a very long time, possibly as far back as 1200 BC, building a seafaring culture perfectly adapted to life among the reefs and lagoons. But by the late 19th century, the wider world had come calling. The islands were absorbed into the German colonial empire as a protectorate, one small piece of a scattered collection of German possessions in the Asian and Pacific hemisphere that also included German Samoa and German New Guinea. That arrangement did not last. When the First World War broke out, Japanese forces moved in and took control, and when Germany's overseas empire was carved up in 1919, Japan kept the islands for itself. Japanese rule lasted until the autumn of 1944, when the tide of the Second World War finally reached the Marshalls. Japan had stationed a garrison of up to 28,000 troops across the islands, but its ground fortifications were weak, and Tokyo had decided the archipelago would serve only as a delaying position, rather than a place to be defended to the last. In a series of hard-fought battles in 1944, American forces swept aside the thinly spread Japanese defenders and turned the islands into a launching pad for the campaigns that would carry the war toward Japan's home islands. Pockets of Japanese resistance held out until the very end, and it was only after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 that Japanese morale collapsed. The garrison on one of the southeastern Marshall Islands became the first overseas Japanese force to formally surrender to the United States, laying down its arms on the 22nd of August, 1945. After the war, the United States took over administration of the islands under an agreement with the newly formed United Nations, governing them as part of what was called the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. The Marshall Islands would not gain independence until the 1980s through an arrangement known as the Compact of Free Association. Even now, though, the country leans heavily on American economic aid and defense guarantees, uses the US dollar as its currency, and grants its citizens visa-free access to the United States. But this relationship has never been a one-way street. In exchange for all of this, the islands paid a staggering price, for they became the testing ground for America's most fearsome weapons, leaving behind a legacy of illness, displacement, and environmental ruin that endures to this day. And at the very center of that story sits Bikini Atoll. Bikini is a surprisingly tangled coral atoll with a surprisingly tangled history. It was first sighted by Western explorers in the early 1800s, when the Russian naval officer Otto von Kotzebue and his crew landed there. Kotzebue, a Baltic German serving in the Russian Navy, gave the atoll a German name, and that name stuck through the years when the atoll fell under German control. Once the Japanese took over, however, the local name Bikini was restored, and the Japanese military maintained a small garrison there as an outpost supporting a larger base on nearby Kwajalein Atoll. Kwajalein became the scene of savage fighting in the summer of 1944. Of the nearly 8,800 personnel Japan had deployed there, including forced laborers, almost 7,800 were killed in a brutal three-day battle. On Bikini itself, the story was smaller but no less grim. Only a handful of Japanese defenders remained by the time American forces closed in, and those last few took their own lives rather than be captured, allowing the Americans to occupy the atoll without a fight. Around the same time, encouraging news was arriving from the deserts of New Mexico. The atomic bomb, developed at Los Alamos, was ready, and the following year it would bring the Second World War to a decisive and terrible end. But the United States already had its eyes on even larger weapons, and it needed somewhere remote to test them, far from prying eyes and populated coastlines. In Bikini, it had found exactly that, an isolated patch of ocean, well away from the world's shipping lanes and flight paths, seemingly perfect for the task ahead. Bikini's role in the nuclear story began in 1946, when the United States selected it for Operation Crossroads, a series of atomic tests meant to study how nuclear explosions would affect naval warships. At that time, the native community of the atoll numbered just 167 people. Shortly after the war ended, President Harry S. Truman ordered Army and Navy officials to find a suitable location in the Marshalls, and Bikini's remoteness made it the obvious candidate. In February 1946, the military governor of the Marshall Islands, Commodore Ben H. Wyatt, arrived on the atoll and gathered the islanders. He convinced them to leave their homes, assuring them that they would be able to return once the tests were finished. Trusting that promise, the community agreed and chose to resettle on Rongerik Atoll, about 140 miles away. They moved out in March 1946. The tests began that summer, and they did not stop for a very long time. Between 1946 and 1958, the U.S. military carried out 67 nuclear detonations across the Marshall Islands, with 23 of them at Bikini alone. The first, part of Operation Crossroads, took place on the 1st of July, 1946, when a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Gilda over the fleet of target ships anchored in Bikini Lagoon. The weapon missed its mark and detonated high above the surface, sparing most of the ships, but killing a large share of the test animals placed aboard them. A second test, Crossroads Baker, followed within weeks. Soon after, military planners decided that further atomic tests offered little new value, and a planned third test for 1947 was canceled. That did not mean the military was finished with Bikini. Instead, attention shifted toward a far more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb, which had the potential to be perhaps 10 times more destructive than the atomic bombs that had leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By now, the Cold War was hardening, and the arms race with the Soviet Union gave the program a fresh sense of urgency. Each new device had to be bigger, deliverable, and proven to work, and proving it meant setting the real thing off in the open air. Somewhere the shockwave and fallout would fall on an empty ocean rather than an American city. The remote atolls of the Marshalls, so far from anywhere that mattered to Washington, once again fit that grim requirement perfectly. The first full-scale hydrogen device, codenamed Ivy Mike, was detonated on nearby Enewetak Atoll in 1952, and it was a success, obliterating the small island it sat on entirely. Thermonuclear testing continued across the region, and it was this new generation of weapons that would produce the single most catastrophic test of all. In March 1954, back at Bikini Lagoon, the United States detonated a device codenamed Castle Bravo. It produced a blast of around 15 megatons, roughly 3 times more powerful than its designers had predicted. The explosion vaporized 3 of the islands in the atoll and tore a crater more than a mile wide into the floor of the lagoon. Worse still, the fallout scattered radioactive debris across an enormous area, drifting over inhabited islands and causing severe harm to people who had nothing to do with the test. It even contaminated the 23-man crew of a Japanese fishing vessel sailing some 80 miles away. One of those fishermen died of radiation sickness 6 months later. Castle Bravo became the worst radiological disaster in American history and ignited a wave of international outrage against atmospheric nuclear testing. It also badly contaminated Rongelap Atoll, roughly 100 miles east of Bikini, forcing its residents to be evacuated. Some returned in 1957, but lingering health effects made the atoll unlivable, and its people were eventually removed for good, evacuated by a Greenpeace vessel in 1985. While the world reacted to these explosions, the original people of Bikini were suffering a slower, quieter tragedy. For the Marshallese, land is not simply a place to live, but the foundation of identity itself, passed down through family lines, tied to ancestors buried in its soil, and bound up in the fishing grounds and coconut groves that had sustained the community for centuries. Being cut off from Bikini was not just an inconvenience. It severed a people from the very source of who they were, and the places they were sent to could not begin to replace it. Once Operation Crossroads got underway, the relocated islanders had effectively been left to fend for themselves on Rongerik, and it proved a harsh place to live. Rongerik was smaller than Bikini, with inadequate supplies of food and fresh water. The islanders found that its coconut trees and food crops yielded very little, and there was even a deep-rooted local belief that the atoll was haunted by evil spirits. By 1947, they were starving. The promise that they would soon go home turned out to be hollow, as the tests were rapidly turning their homeland into a radioactive wasteland. Over the years, the Bikinians were moved again and again in search of somewhere livable. They were relocated to Kwajalein for a time, then to Kili Island, nearly 500 miles south of Bikini. But Kili offered little relief. A single small island with no sheltered lagoon, it was vulnerable to typhoons and high waves, and the community once more found itself battling hunger. During this period, the Bikinians signed an agreement handing over full use of their atoll to the United States. In return, they received rights to Kili and several islands in another atoll, along with a lump sum of $25,000 in cash and a trust fund of $300,000, which paid out modest semi-annual interest, only around $15 per person per year. Still, no amount of money could replace what the community truly longed for: a return to the atoll of their ancestors. By the late 1960s, the islanders had simply had enough of waiting. In 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed an order permitting the community to return to Bikini if they wished, and many chose to do so despite the obvious risks. The U.S. Department of Defense agreed to a cleanup effort meant to make the atoll habitable again, which included replanting coconut trees and building new housing. By the mid-1970s, around 100 Bikinians were living on the atoll once more, but the resettlement soon ran into disaster. In 1978, testing revealed that radiation levels in the local food were dangerously high, especially in the coconuts, which were found to contain elevated levels of the radioactive isotope cesium-137, absorbed straight from the contaminated soil. The people were displaced yet again and returned to Kili, where most of them and their descendants have remained ever since. And so the legacy of some of the most destructive weapons ever built by humankind still hangs heavily over Bikini Atoll. Its islands remain uninhabited, visited only by a few seasonal caretakers and the occasional research or diving expedition. In a strange twist, the atoll's radioactive contamination has turned it into an accidental nature preserve, where coral reefs and abundant marine life now flourish in the near-total absence of people. Another eerie phenomenon appeared in the years after the tests, when so-called floating islands were spotted drifting across the lagoon. These turned out to be enormous slabs of coral reef, blasted loose by the detonations and buoyed to the surface by gases rising from the seabed in the wake of Castle Bravo. Witnessed by many observers, these ghostly masses eventually sank or eroded away. In 2010, in recognition of everything it represents, the Bikini Atoll nuclear test site was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, honored as a place that both confirmed humanity's entry into the nuclear era and bears witness to the human cost of nuclear testing through displacement and public health disaster. For the people of Bikini, that struggle has never really ended. Since the 1970s, they have fought a long and frustrating campaign for fair compensation for their displacement and the many illnesses they have endured. A series of funds were set up over the years, including a resettlement trust for the Bikini people, and with the signing of the Compact of Free Association, a reparations provision worth $75 million payable over 15 years. Yet over time, both the payments and the health coverage provided by the United States dwindled. An independent international tribunal established in 1988 ordered the U.S. to pay the modern equivalent of well over $2 billion in healthcare and resettlement costs, but the American government refused, arguing that its obligations had ended with the compact payments. That dispute remains unresolved to this very day. By the mid-2000s, the population of Bikinians and their descendants had grown to more than 3,000 people. Not one of them has returned to live on the nuclear atoll. Most now live on Kili, in the Marshallese capital of Majuro, or in the United States itself, a people scattered far from a homeland that, thanks to a handful of blinding flashes over a distant lagoon, may not truly be safe to live on again for generations. And that, in the end, is why nobody can live on Bikini Atoll anymore.